They called him the last great Viking king, not because he came last in time, but because no one after him led a Viking-age army the same way. Harald Hardrada was forged where most people were meant to crumble. He was exiled and defeated. He didn't just survive, he began to thrive. He learned how empires breathed, how armies moved, how fear bends men long before steel ever touches their bones. By the time he wore a crown, he wasn't just a king of Norway. He was a walking memory of everything the Viking world had been at its height. And that's what made Harald's rule so important. If Harald failed, this wasn't just a lost battle. This was a death sentence to an entire way of life. So when Harald marched towards England, history held its breath, because if he fell, the Viking age would fall with him. Harald didn't inherit greatness. He bled his way into it. As a teenager, he was driven from his homeland by defeat. Not metaphorical defeat, real defeat. Loss in battle, dead bodies in the mud. His future was being erased because in the North, what followed was exile. But when a person embraces exile as opportunity, then it's not about what was lost, but about what couldn't have been gained otherwise. For Harald, exile was a brutal education. Years of wandering, years of fighting for survival, years where loyalty shifted like the sea's tide and betrayal was paid for in gold and delivered by steel. At one point, he was little more than a weapon for hire, fighting wars that weren't his, under banners that couldn't care if he lived or died. But those years didn't diminish him, they sharpened him. Harald fought for emperors before he ever claimed a crown. He watched how empires ruled, how armies were fed, paid, disciplined, and unleashed. He learned what real power looked like, how it was obtained and held. This wasn't a peek into some local lord with sprawling territory at odds with his neighbor. No, this was a front row seat to an empire that was making moves on the world stage. Losing a battle may be enough to ruin a person, but you add to that exile and the darkest days of his life, and very few people would live to tell the tale, let alone rise to power. But that's exactly what happened to Harald. He fought, he lost, and that is where our story begins. The battle was raging. King Olaf and his men fought against their fellow countrymen in a pivotal civil war. Olaf was making one last push to reclaim the throne and reunite the land under the banner of Christianity. But many farmers, traders, fishermen, and local landowners didn't embrace the idea of a single king over all the land. Olaf and his army, they were outnumbered by the common folk, but they were well armed and trained, and they lived for these moments. The field trembled under the overcast sky. The light was strangely dim. The shields slammed and splintered. Spears. On the battlefield, men stood engaged under the overcast sky. The light was strangely dim. Shields slammed and splintered. Spear points, farm tools, and axes raised and lowered. Some struck wood, others struck flesh. Olaf's men looked like they were going to win easily. Their weapons connected more often than the untrained, but the untrained possessed numbers. And while one-on-one, Olaf's men would dominate, but this wasn't one-on-one. It was 2-on-1, 3-on-1. And then the numbers continued to climb as more and more soldiers fell. The heart of Norway pressed forward in a fury. The air, it smelled like churned earth and warm blood. In the chaos, a spear was hurled in a random direction and it struck Olaf in the stomach. In that moment of shock, the world seemed to slow. It slowed to a still for Olaf as he considered the severity of the wound. But the battle around him didn't wait to find out, because a blade came in immediately and struck Olaf in the neck, and then a decisive blow from another came in, penetrating his skull. Olaf fell on the battlefield, sword in hand, and his brother, or half-brother, watching from afar. From the edge of the chaos stood a 15-year-old Harald Hardrada. He was positioned on the edge with a small contingent to stop anyone from the opposition that tried to flee. He witnessed his half-brother stagger and be swallowed by the tide. When the battle finally concluded, there were only a handful of Olaf's men who remained alive, defeated and dejected. The men were sentenced to death or banishment. 15-year-old Harald was banished. What came next is not what most people would have expected. The young man didn't follow what most men did during the Viking Age. A majority of Scandinavians, they would have migrated south or west. Instead, Harald turned east. He crossed the frozen rivers and the hostile lands, keeping a low profile, listening to and following rumors instead of maps. Every mile he traveled shed the softness from him. He crossed frozen rivers. From Norway, he likely slipped east into what is now Sweden, moving through the forest thick with pine and silence. He hit a key traveling post along the way, like Birka. And the merchants there, they would have spoken of river roads to the east, great wealth in Miklagard. But he had never heard about this great city before. He was intrigued. He would have skirted countless lakes on his way to the Baltic coast. He crossed the unforgiving sea and he landed on the shores of Estonia, where Norse traders had an established presence, raiders as well. The Baltic was not a friendly place. The waters were turbulent, and the people could go from ally to rival with the turning of the tide. From there, he continued east, a well-worn trade route that led him to the land of the Slavs and the Rus. The Rus were fairly hospitable and pointed him in the direction of the river road that would take him as far as Kiev and the Black Sea. Kiev was a hub of the Rus world, where Norse blood and Slavic soil had already mingled for generations. Harald saw many familiar and foreign pieces of culture all at once. To Harald, it was like Trondheim, only larger, warmer, and a blend of something special. Tempted to stay, Harald continued on south along the Dnieper River to the Black Sea, where the air was warm, and he tried figs for the first time. And beyond the Black Sea, at the end of the water road, rose Miklagard. That's Old Norse for the great city. And that great city? Constantinople. Gold domes flashing in the sun, walls thicker than any fortress in the north, harbors choked with ships from lands Harald had never heard of. The journey itself was instrumental in forming who he became, but what happens next is what would lead to one day him returning as King of Norway. By the time he stood before the gates of the greatest city in the world, he was no longer fleeing Norway. He was advancing towards destiny. In Constantinople, Harald joined the Varangian Guard. He fought for emperors who lived in marble halls and became their personal bodyguard and weapon. With his close proximity to the throne, he learned how armies were paid, how loyalty was bought, and how fear was managed. He saw what real power looked like, and it wasn't sagas or superstitions or shouting. It was logistics, discipline, and training. He rose quickly through the ranks and gained favor with those who mattered. He wasn't just sent to fight in the lands that smelled of incense covered in dust against enemies who would not break when they charged. He was sent to command men and lead them on the battlefield. In one campaign south of the Black Sea, Harald led a night assault across a narrow causeway. The plan, it hinged on silence, and it might have worked, but one man tripped. That single sound, it woke up the darkness, and the battle began. Steel rang, men screamed, then the line buckled. Harald's men were not in an advantageous position, but Harald rallied them and formed a shield wall. Without fear, he moved forward. Others hesitated, some fled, but when the shield wall wavered, Harald's unit pushed forward, and one by one, the enemy fell, and the tide shifted. Even though the attack didn't go according to plan, Harald and his men were victorious. That single battle alone yielded more gold than Harald had ever seen in one place at one time in his life. To the victors go the spoils, but so does envy. One moment everyone is rooting for his success, and the next they're plotting his downfall. Harald continued to move forward, but with every change of emperor, he was either loved and employed or despised and chained. In both cases, Harald was learning valuable lessons that would serve him in the future, because a return to Norway was just around the corner. But before he could return home, there was one last battle. Back in favor with the current emperor, he was commissioned to squash a small uprising before it could gain momentum. It was a skirmish, a minor skirmish, turned into ambush. He and his men, armed and confident, marched on towards what they thought would be a routine fight. They traveled the path through the rolling hills of the countryside west of Constantinople, where the land rises and lowers, grassy hills and narrow rock canyons and carved valleys. What began as open farmland turned into a rocky ridge that could hide 100 men if you weren't watching. With the sun beginning its descent for the day, and with the intel Harald had, they would break and set up camp once they exited the ridge area. The plan was to move on in the morning before the sun came up and to meet the enemy before they were fully prepared for the day. With the sun rising behind Harald's men, it would have had a blinding effect on the rebels. Instead, moments before they reached the edge of the canyon, Harald noticed small rocks tumbling down the cliff wall, and then again. Dirt cascading down like something that hadn't moved in 100 years was being disturbed. Harald looked up and caught the shape of something, just for a moment, a glint of silver, a helmet maybe, and it was there and gone in a split second. Harald didn't hesitate. He yelled loud enough for the men in the back of the line to hear, and the rock walls on either side, they echoed his call. Shields! Arrows fell like rain. Harald raised his shield, dismounted from his horse, but before he could get to the others, he felt the impact and the pain. He stumbled, felt a sharp stitch with his next breath. Looking down, he could see an arrow sticking out of his side. The next breath was harder than the last, but the arrows kept coming. The shield wall was now a shield roof protecting the men, for now. What happens next is something that no one expected. Harald didn't fall. He snapped the shaft of that arrow. It was anything but clean, and every bit heroic. He broke it close to the wound, and he drove himself forward before the pain could convince him otherwise. Blood wet and warm at his side, his focus re-engaged. He roared, "Forward!" And they did not retreat. There was nowhere to go. The only path was forward. The enemy expected panic, expected confusion in the narrow canyon. Instead, they saw the Varangians form a line of shields locked, boots grinding in the stone, Harald at the front, giving commands as they moved towards the terrain where the cliffs faded into the hills. They had become a beast, moving as one and winding their way up the hill to the upper ridge where the arrows rained down. The arrows continued until the first few archers were swallowed by the living shield wall. The high ground advantage had evaporated all at once, and the arrows stopped. The archers, they had fled. They had miscalculated Harald's response. That was all it took. The ambush broke. When it was over, Harald stood taller, stronger, more confident than ever before. One hand braced his sword, the other his wound at his side, blood soaked in his tunic. The canyon, it smelled of dust and iron. His men, they stared at him, half in awe, half in disbelief. He probably should have died there. The arrow, it hit his fifth rib at an angle, an inch in either direction, and the story ends in that canyon. Instead, he lived, completed his mission, amassed tremendous wealth, reputation, and a clear path to the throne of Norway. Now let's take a moment to uncover the real history, the real facts about Harald Hardrada, which are every bit as intriguing as our story. We will touch on some little-known pieces of history that are, as you will see, a big deal. Then you're going to want to hear the myth versus reality section and compare the two. So these facts about Harald Hardrada begin not with a crown, but again with defeat. It was a battle that we described earlier. It was fought in 1030 in central Norway, inland from the coast among farmers and the rolling fields rather than the dramatic cliffs of the fjords. This was not a foreign invasion, it was a civil war. Harald's half-brother, King Olaf, he was attempting to reunite Norway. He wanted a unified kingdom, but the locals, they were aligned with the Danish rule. The conflict wasn't necessarily about kingship, it was about control, loyalty, and religion. Olaf's return carried Christian authority with it, and many Norwegian elites resented both his rule and the faith that he represented. The opposing force was larger, local, and deeply motivated. When the fighting ended, Olaf, he lay dead on the field. Harald was only 15. Because he was marked by association with the fallen king, in Viking society, defeat didn't always mean death. In this case, it meant exile. Norway was no longer safe for him. Staying would have meant submission, conversion of loyalty, or execution, and Harald chose the only path left to him. He accepted exile. That defeat would shape everything that followed. The day in the battlefield, Harald did not learn how to win. He learned how fragile power is, how quickly kings fall, and how unforgiving history can be to those who arrived unprepared. Exile was common in those days, and most Vikings would have fled west towards England or Francia. Harald, he went the opposite direction, traveled east through the river system of Eastern Europe, moving from settlement to settlement, trading violence for passage until he reached the crown jewel of the medieval world. Constantinople, it was unlike anything Northmen had ever seen, known to the Vikings as Miklagard, the great city. It was massive, it was wealthy, it was orderly, and it had terrifying power. It had towers, walls, harbors, crowded with ships from every known land, and gold all over, more gold than any city at that time. Markets overflowed with silk, spices, and silver. This was the trading hub of the entire world. The empire did not raid for wealth, it generated it. Here, Harald joined the Varangian Guard, an elite force of foreign warriors sworn directly to the emperor himself. And Vikings were prized not for their strength alone, but for their distance from Byzantine politics. They also had no local loyalties, and they fought for pay and honor. Harald thrived in this environment. He served emperors who commanded armies spanning continents. He fought in disciplined formation, not wild charges. He witnessed sieges planned months in advance, supply lines and how to protect them, and soldiers how to pay them regularly so that they would continue to fight. He learned warfare through administration and the political policies that surround war. This inside information is what reshaped Harald's perspective and what helped him rule an entire empire when he returned to Scandinavia. Harald proved that a Viking could become more than a raider. He could be a ruler. Harald has always been known as the last king of the Viking Age. But what he was more than the last king. He was a bridge for the North to cross over and become something even greater. Not only that, his legacy opened the road for the North to serve in Byzantium for years to come. Historical sources place him and his campaigns across the Mediterranean world, including fighting rebels, pirates, and foreign armies. He gained a reputation not just for courage, but for competence. He was promoted, trusted, and feared. And he grew extremely wealthy. Byzantine service, it paid in gold and silver, and Harald invested wisely. He sent his money back to Scandinavia to build influence long before he returned. Wealth was power in the Viking world, and Harald was amassing both. But Byzantium, it was also dangerous. Political shifts were swift and lethal. When emperors fell, allies were imprisoned or executed. Harald himself was eventually caught in a palace power struggle, imprisoned, and then escaped through bribery, cunning, and a little bit of force. This was a lesson that he remembered, how quickly things can turn and how quickly kings can fall. When Harald finally left Constantinople, he was no longer a refugee, but a weapon. He was older, richer, and much, much wiser. And he was ready now to reclaim what he believed was rightly his. Harald returned to Scandinavia around 1046 with silver, gold, a small army, and a reputation that preceded him. Norway was ruled by his nephew, Magnus the Good. He had already consolidated power throughout Norway. Rather than fighting a civil war, Harald chose to use wealth, the promise of increase, strength of working together. And Magnus, he agreed. He agreed to a joint rule. Magnus died shortly after the agreement to co-reign, leaving Harald alone at the top. Harald became king by process of elimination, and even though history swirls with natural explanation, one can only wonder if something nefarious was at play. With Harald in control, he crushed rivals, enforced royal authority, and subdued rebellious chieftains. He ruled harshly, efficiently, much like he had witnessed in Byzantium. The name Hardrada, that would later be understood as hard ruler, and it fit. Harald believed stability came through strength, not compromise. Under his reign, Norway became more centralized, more disciplined, and more feared. But Harald was not content. He had seen how empires expand, and he thought of his own version of Byzantium. And this thought, this dream, was not something that he could shake. The north, it was too small for what he had become. In 1066, England was fractured. King Edward had just died without a clear heir. Multiple claims competed for legitimacy. Harald was about to make his claim, but his claim would have to come from a decisive battle. If Harald conquered England, he would not just be King of Norway, he would be ruler of the North Sea. Viking dominance would be restored on a scale unseen since Canute the Great. This was not a raid. This was an attempt for Harald to take his place among the greatest rulers of the world, including those from Rome and Byzantium. Harald landed in the north of England, and initially he succeeded with every battle. Everything was going according to plan. He defeated local forces, secured hostages, gained confidence while weakening the resolve of the local standing army. With a few hundred hostages in hand, he wanted to negotiate near Stamford Bridge. He was negotiating from a position of strength, and he didn't expect any resistance. That assumption would prove fatal. King Godwinson of England, he marched his army north, and he marched at an unprecedented speed, covering nearly 200 miles in only a few days. Harald's men, they were caught off guard. Many had left their armor behind, including Harald. It was extremely hot that day, and so why wear armor when all you're supposed to do is talk? Well, there was no negotiation. There was no discussion. The English attacked, and they attacked hard and fast. Harald's men attempted to form a shield wall, but disorganization and a lack of armor meant this wasn't a battle as much as a slaughter. Legend tells of a lone Viking with a shield and a sword holding his ground on the bridge, trying to buy time for the rest of the remaining army. Harald fought without armor. He rallied his men, refused retreat, and pressed forward, feeling as if destiny was on his side. Then an arrow struck him in the throat. The king swung his sword one last time, taking the life of an Englishman before his strength failed. Falling to his knees and then tipping forward, he laid on the cold grass while the last bit of life left him, and so did his dream of a Viking-ruled England. At least, that's what one would think. But here's the twist. There was another conqueror with Norse roots who was making inroads in southern England, and he, eventually, would succeed. Once Harald had fallen, the leadership collapsed. Reinforcements from back of the camp arrived too late. Harald's army was shattered. With Harald's death, the Viking Age, according to historians, officially came to an end. But did it? If it did end, it wasn't because Scandinavia was weak. It was because the world was changing quickly. Harald Hardrada lived a life so extreme that historians still struggle to decide whether everything we know is true, or if it's just another made-up saga with traces of truth. Here are the facts. Before he was king, Harald was a hired sword for the Byzantine emperor, serving in the Varangian Guard. That we know is true. The details of this time are what are often called into question. Sources suggest Harald fought across the empire in Sicily against Muslim forces in Bulgaria. Some later sagas even place him in Jerusalem, not as a pilgrim, but as a soldier of fortune. Whether every location is precise matters less than the pattern. Harald learned war on a world stage, and what he learned translated into an extremely successful kingship when he returned to Norway. If it wasn't for just one misstep, history as we know it may have been very different. Here are a few quick facts. He was the richest king in Europe at the time of his reign. A combination of his time in Byzantium and inheriting all the wealth from the throne after his cousin died, he was extremely wealthy. The name Hardrada means hard ruler. This wasn't just a nickname for the battlefield. It's described his style of rule in Norway. He had no mercy for rival chieftains. He ruled more like a Byzantine emperor than a traditional Norse king. And here's one that most people don't know. Harald wasn't just a fighter. He was what some would consider a skald, a storyteller, or a poet. There's one surviving poem attributed to Harald where he mocks his enemies who doubted him, essentially saying his deeds would speak louder than their insults. And now, let me set the record straight. There are some myths out there, but then there's reality, and it's always good to consider the one and balance it with what is real. Harald, he wasn't just a savage Viking raider. Come on. He was actually the most experienced, internationally experienced military leaders of the Middle Ages. And that's why he was so successful. Another myth is that the Vikings vanished because they were defeated at Stamford Bridge. And while that is a seminal moment in the history of the Viking Age, the reality is they didn't vanish. They had begun to already adapt. The truth is the Battle of Stamford Bridge, it would have been the final battle of the Viking Age, regardless of the outcome. Even if Harald had won, the Viking Age was still coming to an end because the world was changing. The last myth I'll share is that Stamford Bridge was somehow a foolish mistake on Harald's part. The reality is it wasn't. It was a rational move based on timing, intelligence, and precedence. It failed because an English king felt like he had only one shot, a Hail Mary, one try to defeat a man who would otherwise take over a vulnerable kingdom. And that roll of the dice, well, it worked for the English. The life of Harald Hardrada leaves us with some uncomfortable truth. Victory yesterday, it doesn't guarantee success today. Harald did almost everything right. He learned, he adapted, he survived exile, empires, and war. He became stronger where others would have broken, and yet the very experiences that made him great also blinded him. He let his guard down, and it cost him dearly. But remember that first battle where his side was defeated. And remember that saying, what doesn't kill you will only make you stronger. That's true if you're willing, like Harald, to embrace it. He learned from that battle. He traveled further. He gained more wisdom and experiences that he would never have had if he hadn't lost that initial battle. So losing isn't always the end. In fact, sometimes it leads us to experience something greater than we would have otherwise. Don't let success blind you, and don't let failure define you. Don't let your guard down, and know that every battle lost may be the very thing that sets you up to accomplish and achieve things that you only dreamed of. History also reminds us that enormous outcomes, they also hinge on small moments. A march taken faster than expected. Armor left behind because the day was hot and everything felt safe. A single arrow. A single choice. Don't overlook the small stuff. Embrace defeat and learn from it. Move forward, develop, gain wisdom, and face every opportunity with courage. Don't underestimate the opposition. Be prepared. And here's what I'm asking of you. The number of listeners of this podcast is off the charts. But that means that many are forgetting to subscribe and follow. If you just click that button, it will help this podcast grow more than you know. I want to thank you, first and foremost, for listening, being a part of this journey. And if this story, if it stirred something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who's standing at a crossroads, someone who's navigating change, someone who's wondering if the last defeat is what's going to define their future. Tell them it's not. It's going to make them stronger. And if you would, leave a review. Just say, this episode, it meant this to me, and it will guide people. It will help others find the stories that they need to hear. The Viking world is alive, full of legacy, full of lore, but full of lessons for us to learn from and to grow. So until next time, be bold, be strong, and awaken the Viking in you.